Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, and we'll get started in just a moment.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. I think we can get started as everyone's introducing themselves in the chat. I'm going to do a quick update, not a ton of new information this week from us, but I want to share a couple of things, and then we're going to have Emily share some updates from the state. And then we have Jen and Arthur from Slover Linett and Placa Cohen who are going to share some initial findings with us from a study about arts audiences and what they're looking for in these times, how they're being impacted by COVID, which is going to be really interesting. But to start, from a public health update, as of today, there are 13,924 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Boston residents. Over 10,000 of those now have fully recovered and 723 have died. We are still moving cautiously forward in phase 3, step 1 of the statewide reopening plan. And we're really just watching data closely every day, looking at those key health metrics and making sure that we're still going in the right direction, which we are. This is now a couple of weeks, or now 3 weeks, going on 3 weeks of some places being open, testing new limits on gatherings that allow for more people. So we're trying to see how things are actually tracking in terms of public health metrics. And that's really how we're going to continue to base decisions on whether or not we need to be more restrictive or we can stay where we are. And obviously whether or not the state can go on to the next step. So one of those metrics that I wanted to share for the week ending in July 13th, the city's positive test rate was 2.1%, down from 2.5% the week before. So that's the percent of people tested who are positive for COVID, and that's one of the key indicators that we're looking at. So we want to see that number continue to go down. If it goes back up 1 week, we want to make sure it goes back down the next week. And what we're trying to keep an eye out for is that we don't see that percent kind of creep up week over week. The basics still matter: face covering, 6 feet of distance, avoid crowds, even if you have the opportunity to be in a larger group of people, wash your hands frequently in clean surfaces. And the public health colleagues have asked us to continue to repeat that, because as we get kind of more and more into reopening, people think we don't have to do that as much, and it's still washing your hands is still the #1 thing that you should be doing. I do also want to remind everybody that the city has expanded testing sites and urge everybody to get tested. Again, if you have any questions, check the mayor's health line or boston.gov/coronavirus, which has a map and information about testing locations. If you have any questions, you can always call the health line. And then just a couple of arts office updates that I want to share. We have reopened the Opportunity Fund, which includes grants of $1,000 to individual artists to share their work with the public or take advantage of an opportunity related to their creative practice. We also have the COVID Fund is still open. You can tell it's the end of the week. Slightly easier now. I'm going to share a spreadsheet that has vendor IDs for every organization that has applied for a grant with us in the last 5 years. I think 3 years, 5 years. So that if you're still having trouble with the vendor ID process, or you haven't even started yet, we've made it that much easier. You can find your organization name and your vendor ID in this spreadsheet. So slightly easier as we try to make that a more streamlined process. But those applications are due at the end of the month. So please apply. And then finally, just a little bit of housekeeping. We're not going to have a meeting next Friday, although we will provide any updates over email, especially if we have any other news on reopening or on public health. We're going to take a couple of breaks kind of going into August here. And I think that is it for me. Emily, I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Cara. Great. Thanks, Cara. So hello all. So I'm going to start with our federal update. So I talked last week about the fourth stimulus bill, and I think I said, like, we expected this the coming week. Sorry, hopefully we need to cross our fingers, not our finders, for Monday. So the expectation now is that McConnell and the Senate will release the bill on Monday at the earliest. I've included an action that you can take to reach out to your members of Congress and your senators, specifically your senators, to make sure that the HEROES Act provisions that we really want to see are included in that fourth stimulus bill. That's including expansion of PPP, expansion of the federal pandemic unemployment compensation, and then more money to the NEA, the NEH, and the IMLS. The other thing that I wanted to just bring up is that there are two bills, the Restart Act and the Save Our Stages Act. Both of these bills are really focused on live venues and the needs that they have in terms of the amount of loss that they've incurred, and the staff and the workers who are in live venues. This work has been put together by the National Independent Venues Association, and I've included a link to their action alert for both of these bills. And their website is really great. Like, there's some really good information and fact sheets that I would highly encourage you to take a look at. It's not just the for-profit venues. They also, especially Save Our Stages and the Restart Act, do call out nonprofit venues. So it's something that we're taking a look at and we encourage you to take a look at as well. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide. Thanks. So I just wanted to briefly talk. Earlier today, Baker announced some travel restrictions. So out-of-state travelers have to self-isolate for 14 days or submit a negative COVID test that's no more than 72 hours old. If they do not do that, they will be fined $500 per day. And low-risk states in that are exempt, and that has to do, the low-risk qualification has to do with the number of cases of COVID, and currently it's this list here. But I just wanted to bring this up in just to sort of like flag that COVID is still happening, and that we are all in this together. As Cara sort of said, like, we have to keep doing these masks and public health preventions, and that if we want our sector to be able to reopen, we have to do all these things to keep people healthy. And maybe don't go out of state, or don't invite your out of state friends to join you in Massachusetts. Okay, moving along. Thank you. So now let's talk about money. So about 2 hours ago, Baker signed the COVID-19 spending bill. That's a $1.1 billion bill. It includes $2 million for small cultural nonprofits. Small is defined as under 25 staff members. This spending bill was put together, and it includes everything that the state believes it can have reimbursed by the federal government. So that's how they came up with that number and that and that amount. So Baker signed it, so now it's going to happen. It's moving through. The other thing that happened today, which frankly, to me was a delightful surprise, is that the Economic Development Bill, the House Ways and Means actually released their draft. Included in it was two funds that total up $2 million in relief for arts, culture, and education. The first one specifically calls out artists and puts money aside for artists to showcase and expand their work. It's like a lot of like tech. It's meant to fund tech to allow people to expand their reach. Local museums are also called out in that specific fund. Interestingly enough, it's just local museums and artists. We are working right now with the chair, McMurtry, who's chair of Tourism, Arts, and Cultural Development on the House side, on an amendment that would change that to qualify any arts and cultural nonprofit, and to hopefully increase the amount of money in that fund. So it would go from 5 to 10. The legislation also includes, it would create a study, a commission to study the effects of COVID-19 on the cultural and creative sector and make recommendations for recovery. That's great. What's really great is that that commission isn't just a commission, but there's actual money laid out in this bond bill for relief for our sector. So what is the action to take? Hold tight. So amendments have to be filed at 5 today, and then we'll know what those amendments are over the weekend, and we will stand up several opportunities to both educate on what's included and encourage you to reach out to your lawmakers about this bill. And as we know, it'll go through the House, then it has to move over to the Senate. They have their own process. Then they have to do a conference committee, and then the governor has to sign it. So this is step one, but it's an important first step. And I'm relieved that there is call outs to our sector in this bill, in the House version. That signals something important, which signals that all of our advocacy and our outreach to lawmakers is making a difference. So thank you for these things appearing in the legislation. Okay, moving on. So I just want to also flag right now, the House is debating, they're in their third day of debating the comprehensive police reform bill. The Senate debated theirs last week. The House is in the process of debating theirs. They will then go into conference committee, and I just want to flag that for all of us. I know that thinking about how police operate in our communities and the funding for police is something that many of us are considering. And as stewards of our community, as creatives, we see a role for us in that work. Additionally, so the housing, I want to talk a little bit. So the moratorium on evictions and foreclosures was set to expire. That was a bill that I had shared about earlier this year, probably about 3 months ago. Baker extended it, so he had the option to extend it, and he did. But more importantly, there have been 2 bills filed in the Senate with Senator Jalen, and then in the House with, I believe it's Mike Conley, have filed bills that would make the extension, that foreclosure moratorium extend, an eviction moratorium extend for 1 year after Baker lifts the state of emergency declaration. And then it would also freeze all rents for 1 year after that emergency declaration is lifted. So it's not just about making sure people don't get foreclosed on or evicted, it's making sure that there's relief and that the amount of money doesn't just accumulate, and rent relief is really important in this instance. The other thing it does is it creates a fund to support landlords that have 15 or fewer units who are being impacted by this. So there's a way that they're looking towards a way to make sure that people are housing stable. There are 2 actions you can take if you are so inclined. The first one is written testimony is being accepted by the Joint Committee on this. And then the other piece is that City Life Vita Urbana has set up an action alert email where you can directly email your legislators. What's the difference between testimony and an action email? An action email is something that you're sending just to your legislator to say, hey, I care about this. I hope you do too, and I'd like you to see you do this. With written testimony, that's actually entered into like the larger public record. It's included, like I can look up any testimony that someone submits for a bill. And so if you want to do that, you want to make sure that you're really sort of sure on the facts of the issue, because it's a little bit more formal. And City Life Vita Urbana has some really great resources to take a look and talking points that I would encourage you to take a look at. Finally, if we could move to the last slide, my weekly reminders, please consider creating the vote and joining us in making that pledge as both individuals and as organizations. And then make sure that you are taking the census and encouraging your communities to take the census. And if I may, I just want to take one moment to talk about how influential our role is in our communities in terms of making a difference in our advocacy. So earlier this week, the Huntington Theater reached out and said, we want to do an alert to our email list about what's happening with the cultural sector and the need for state safety nets and relief, both on the state and the federal level. I offered both the Americans for the Arts Action Alert as well as our Action Alert, and Michael Massow signed an email that went to their subscribers and their entire email list, encouraging people to stand up and voice their support for arts and culture. We saw the number of people who wrote their legislators after Michael put out that email and Huntington put out that email doubled. So in 4 days, the numbers shot up. That's the power that we all have in terms of sharing the opportunities to advocate for things that we believe in. It's incredibly meaningful to me that the Huntington Theater and Michael did that. And I know that Abigail Norman at the Elliott School is sending out a note as well today to her email list and to the community at the Elliott School. All of this matters. It doesn't matter if your email list is 5 people or 50,000 people. Making sure that our voice is heard at the State House matters. And so I want to thank you all for all of your work, because that's how we make change happen. All right, I am done for today. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Emily. All right, and we're gonna move it over to, I believe, Jen and Arthur for our second part of our presentation today.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Let's just make sure this works. Okay, great. If you can see it, just wave. Awesome. Hi, everybody. Jen and I are so happy to be here today, and I'm super happy because I used to be in this group about 1 million years ago when I started my career in the cultural world as the ICA. I think the galleries were lit by candle and we arrived by stagecoach, but I was there, and it was an awesome time. And this also just a place very close to my heart, physically close right now. I'm actually here at my home on the Cape, so I'm kind of in your same ecosystem right now. So hi, my great friend and colleague Jen from Slover Linett, her firm and our firm, Placa Cohen, have collaborated to create this culture track study triggered by the realities of the COVID crisis, but now with the rapid changes in the environment, the moment of at least dual crisis, both health and social/racial justice, we are continuing to evolve our work as we prepare for yet another wave of it. But today we wanted to share with you some of the key findings that have come out about audience perceptions, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what they're doing, what they're worried about, coming off of the first wave of our study. So Jen and I will kind of take turns taking you through a synopsis of a much, much deeper study. This thing was a big one. If you don't know about it, just to give you a point of comparison, those who maybe were culture track presentations we've done in the past where we had a sample of 4,000 people, we had 125,000 responses for this first wave of the study. We believe it is the largest cultural survey ever of audiences. And we will, as I said, intend to be back in market in September to follow up. But with that, I'm going to start the presentation.
And I'll just jump in to thank
go ahead, Jen.
Cara and Pascal for inviting us back. I was here to invite any interested arts and culture organization from Boston to participate in the study. It feels like yesterday, but a few months ago. So we're delighted that we had really good representation from Boston and happy to be able to share both the national numbers as well as some Boston specific numbers with you all today.
Great. Thanks, Jen. So I also want to just give a shout out. Not only does it take a village, it takes way more than a village. This is an enormous undertaking, and it only happens because we have support from so many organizations. This is something that we do as a service to the field. To make it free for everybody, we need a lot of people helping make sure that we can pay the bills to get it done. In the first round of this survey, the first wave, our lead sponsor was the Wallace Foundation, and we are delighted that a Boston area funder, the Barr Foundation, is going to be among the lead funders for the next wave, along with Art Bridges and Terra. Microsoft has played a great role, which Jen can tell you about, and we've just had all these brilliant specific experts and advisors who helped us make this happen. So we just need to start with a big shout out to them. And with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to Jen to just kind of set the stage in terms of what we were thinking and how we approached trying to understand this moment.
Great, thanks, Arthur. So back in March, when we started conversations, I think we were collectively, as firms that serve and have great respect and admiration for the cultural sector, really concerned about the future of the sector as well as about communities. And so we brought this overarching framework here that we wanted to understand through this survey, opportunities for cultural organizations to help their communities and be more relevant, increase relevance there, but also, and as essential here to the picture, helping communities get a better sense of the needs of their cultural organizations to understand where communities can support cultural organizations. So that's just a kind of an overall founding principle here. Great. And then in terms of the structure of the project, this first dark blue line, which runs kind of from April through July, that's this first wave of quantitative research, which we continue to mine for data. A report was released on the Culture Track website a little over a week ago, right? Almost two weeks now. that's publicly available. That's about 40 pages. This includes some highlights from that, as well as some things that we've actually learned since that report went live. So you can also expect some additional, we're calling them kind of mini chapters that will come out because this data set is so rich and we couldn't possibly cover everything. Sort of in the tension of wanting to get you data out to the field as quickly as possible, but also having so much to explore, we're kind of breaking this up into a number of smaller deliverables coming out going forward. We're also cognizant of the fact that there are a lot of questions that we can't answer through quantitative research. So there's going to be some qualitative phone interviews that are happening, focused particularly on BIPOC communities, as well as ideally some focus groups that we're working on securing some funding for. And then this second wave of research that the Barr Foundation has really come in to help support, which we have planned for later this fall. So circling in deeper on this first wave of quantitative research, when we started to put our heads together, we were thinking that hearing from two particular groups would be essential here, that we wanted to understand sort of the average American with their varied relationships to arts and culture, but we also really wanted to be able to dive deeply into subsections of the arts and culture sector. So we did a kind of dual sampling approach here in which we used a probability sample that we know is nationally representative and worked with NORC at the University of Chicago to pull that sample. We also reached out to all of you through meetings like this, through membership associations and organizations, through our own networks, in as many ways as we could invite arts and culture organizations to participate. And as Arthur mentioned, it's made this into one of the biggest studies of audiences of arts and culture that's ever been conducted, with a combined sample of 124,000 people. Of the 653 cultural organizations that participated, we had a pretty good mix across kind of museums and collections, which includes botanical gardens and zoos, as well as performing arts, which runs the gamut, music, theater, dance, everything in between, and then a pretty broad array of other organizations that consider themselves culture, like modern quilting groups and a walking club up in Maine. So we wanted to cast the net very widely in terms of what we consider to be arts and culture. And then we combined those two samples into one overarching sample using weighting, which is what we'll report on today. Great. So one of the first things that really, I think, was not hugely shocking to us in the fact that the cultural sector has an inclusion problem, but in the extent of the inclusion problem that we found here, was that the lists that came in, the responses that came in through the lists of these participating organizations were really different from the US adult population according to the census. And that we saw really big gaps, particularly among Hispanic and Latinx respondents in terms of the proportion that they made up of these lists, as well as Black or African American, a little less, but also for Asian or Pacific Islanders. I will say that for Boston specifically, these gaps are not quite as wide, which I think is a really admirable trait for Boston. That for Boston, we still see that Hispanic or Latinx is the widest gap, but that gap is 7% instead of 11%. For Asians, it's a 2% gap, so sort of on par with the national average. And then for Black or African Americans, it's a 5% gap from the US population in Boston. So just a sense of sort of where you fit into this picture. And then once we weighted this combined sample, which includes and sort of brought these respondents in from the lists back into proportion with the overall, their proportion of the overall national sample, we wanted to just give you a sense of what the sample looks like at this point. So you can see that we have a really good range of geographies that are present across the country, a nice spread in terms of race or ethnicity and generation, and some interesting variation here in terms of connection to culture, that 23% of respondents had some kind of formal arts affiliation like subscription or membership or volunteering, whereas 95% of respondents at the weighted national level told us that they'd participated in at least one of the really broad range of arts and culture activities that we mentioned. So everyone is connected to arts and culture. I think, again, as we all know, whether or not that connection is sort of a formal connection was a little less present in the general population as we'd expect.
Thanks, Jen. So for today, I just want to kind of give you the roadmap for the remainder of our presentation. We're essentially creating 5 buckets in terms of some of the key findings. But as Jen mentioned before, there's a lot more. I mean, there's an enormous amount that is available to you on the website. So this is really meant to be just kind of an introduction or overview for those who maybe are not familiar with it yet. And we surfaced 5 key areas of interest or inquiry that seem to have some of the most intriguing and potentially actionable headlines. The first one being the impact that the health crisis is directly having on audiences now. Second, what audiences want from cultural organizations today, not when full reopening has occurred, but right now as they're going through this crisis period. Third, a fascinating area that Jen has spent a lot of time digging very deeply into about the role of digital as we all kind of change behaviors in terms of how we both access, use, and share cultural content. Then a whole area around future attendance and to what degree audiences are actively engaged in thinking about and making plans for cultural participation in the future. And then finally, based on a lot of questions from people such as yourselves, just a kind of barometric read on the perceptions around philanthropy and arts and culture during this health crisis. So I'm going to start just by talking a little bit about how immediate and direct the impact has been of this health crisis on audiences. So the way all of our slides are set out is at the top next to the Q. That's exactly the way the question was asked in the questionnaire. And you can see the responses for both of those. So overall, we want to know both how they're feeling physically and to what degree their health has been impacted by the health crisis. And secondly, to what degree their finances and incomes have been impacted. So first of all, again, given the survey period, which was up through May 19th, a quarantine period, not exactly where we are now, so we expect to see some movement on these numbers, but still really indicative as a baseline. About 8 out of 10 people told us that they were under a quarantine or voluntarily quarantining, and about a third of those people said they were caring for. In terms of the physical impact, even though that blue line might not be big, it has a huge kind of resonance when you consider that it means that more than 1 out of 10 people, and again, to visualize that, say you work for a theater and you cordon off 10% of your seats. Imagine that 10, in this case, 12% of those people are people who directly have been physically impacted. Either they themselves, a close friend, or a family member were sick due to COVID-19, and 4 out of 10, almost half the house, have had a reduction in their income that is attributable to the COVID-19 crisis. I don't know, Jen, if you want to share some of the Boston data for that.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in. Thanks for the window, Arthur. So for currently under a stay-at-home order, the Boston sample at the time of this survey was higher at 84%. Caring for children is a little lower, actually, at 20% for the Boston sample, interestingly. Themselves, a family member or a close friend, sick or hospitalized due to COVID at the time of the survey was 16%. Higher than the national. And then income changes actually were pretty parallel with the national numbers, no significant differences there.
Thanks, Jen. So this gets into this notion that we think is super important, what we just call hearts and minds. You know, as you are crafting your invitations, your communications to your audiences at this moment in time, if you can take one big message away from us, it is my mantra: the audience is never neutral, and they are particularly not neutral now. They're carrying around a lot. So whatever message you're extending to them is being introduced into a kind of emotional ecosystem or framework that you really have to understand and navigate and approach with a lot of empathy. So one way to read this chart is anytime that kind of pink area is bigger, or the blue area is bigger than the gray area. The gray means kind of not so much change. But what we see is in 3 metrics: more worried or afraid, more bored, and less connected to others at the very end. All of which are what I would call kind of anxiety metrics, issues of not wanting to stay in the state that you're in. And again, this is specifically attributable to the COVID crisis. This issue of connection or dislocation is really ubiquitous in our survey, that whether we asked it directly or kind of inferred based on the response, there's this drumbeat that comes up again and again and again about people just saying that they really desire to be connected to others and feel very isolated right now. Jen, I don't know if any of these data, there's some Boston things you want to include?
Yeah, there's a few places where this differs. So Boston residents were more likely to be worried or afraid at actually 68%, bored at 57%, angry at 42%, lonely at 43%, and less calm at 43%. So higher emotional impacts on a number of these levels.
Yeah, and that what's interesting to me in that is that those numbers seem to correlate to urban areas, because we did a version of this for New York City recently, and it was very comparable to the numbers that Jen just shared in terms of the difference between that urban population and the national population. So what do audiences want from you guys today? This is a pretty big deal because there is an assumption, at least on some organizations' part, that let's just wait until we can re-enter the market and things have restabilized. But in fact, if you ask the audience, they are expecting you to play a very specific role right now. So there's a couple things that first we wanted to just highlight. 2 questions. What do you want more of in your life right now? And of the activities that are not available right now, what do you miss the most? And what we learned overall is that after getting outside, and again, this survey was conducted during a quarantine period, so keep that in mind. People want connection, connection, connection. They want opportunities to connect with others, and they want fun and kind of positive experiences in their lives. Needs that align really well with what they miss most from cultural experiences. So this is an interesting way of kind of connecting the basic emotional needs in that first question that's in the center of the page to those on the right, which are correlated more specifically to the kinds of cultural activities that they could be, or the benefits that they get from these kind of activities. Did you want to add anything, Jen?
Boston really parallels this pretty closely. The only place where there's an interesting difference here is that Bostonians said that they were more likely to miss celebrating their cultural heritage at 12% versus 6% for the national.
Cool. So this is an important question because we're not asking about the future, we're asking about today. How would you ideally want arts and cultural organizations to be contributing to your community during the crisis? And they could select from a bunch of stuff. And so what we find is that people look to cultural organizations as a source to make them feel better now when they need them most. 53% to laugh and relax, about half the population, connection again, almost half to help them educate their kids while schools are closed, and a little less than that to offer distraction and escape during the crisis. Any Boston numbers we want to add on that, Jen? Are we good?
They're pretty similar. Stay connected is the highest for Boston, actually, at 60%, which is interesting.
Yeah. Great. So when we aggregated all of the questions and the highest level responses, we saw 4 big themes in terms of the utility, that is the value that cultural organizations can play in people's lives today to help them navigate and emotionally be supported through the crisis. One is what we call connection and processing, which includes helping them take care of their kids. The second is this practical support about planning and helping them kind of meet everyday challenges. The third, which at least in the national sample was the single highest response, 53% for emotional support under laugh and relax, closely followed by the fourth group about escaping, just distraction, giving them some happy, positive place to be and to think about and to feel, because there's so much incoming negativity and confusion and uncertainty that they need a place to go to just feel better then.
And interestingly here, express themselves creatively was a fair degree higher for Boston at 44% as a role that they're looking for arts and culture to serve in their lives.
Sorry. So this next section, which Jen is going to take you through, I think has a lot of really interesting insights and potential implications for action relating to what we've all been doing and what we are doing at this very moment, which is living our lives digitally where they used to be led physically and analog. So with that, how are behaviors changing?
Great. So starting at a pretty high level, understanding how people are connecting with digital content around arts and culture during this time of COVID, which again, keep in mind is late April through mid-May here. We found that at the national level, over 3/4 of people had seen some kind of organization offering digital activities around arts and culture during COVID. And over half had actually used or participated in some kind of digital offering from a from a cultural organization during COVID, which feels really high to me. I was excited to see those numbers. But the next one is a little less exciting, that just 13% had paid for one or more digital offerings from a cultural organization during COVID, which just, I think, solidifies the fact that at least at this point in the process, and probably still, that digital isn't really a great revenue driver yet for organizations, but it's allowing people to connect more deeply, and potentially I think there will be some slides later on that support the idea that it's broadening the connections of who you're reaching through your organization as well. For Boston, it's actually 82% aware, so a little bit higher. 64% of the Bostonian general public who had tried it, and 15% who had paid for something. So we were curious to know where people are getting arts and culture content of those who are using it. And so we asked people, where of those digital online activities you're using, where are you getting it from? We were very interested to see here that individual performer, artist, band, or ensemble was quite large in the constellation of destinations that they're going to for digital content. You know, the organization is split up here into pretty specific categories. We see that Performing Arts Center and Zoour Aquarium are quite high, library is also high, theater a little bit lower, and these numbers are pretty consistent with the Boston numbers.
Yeah, I would note, we've looked at some of this information for specific organizations, and those that have kind of a real entrenched position as content presenters and creators seem to be able to work that number much better. For example, Jen and I did workshops recently with Carnegie Hall, Kennedy Center, and the Metropolitan Opera, all of which were able to really get much higher numbers than that 38%. We see there, lower for individual, more people coming to them, to the actual venue or performing arts center to get their content online, which speaks, I think, to the power of brand and perhaps to scale.
Mm-hmm. Great. So when we break out digital content into different kinds of offerings, we see that live stream performances and pre-recorded performances, as well as online classes, are kind of at the left end here. So we've got two sets of bars. The first one here is about the proportion who are aware that that particular type of activity was available. And then the one in gray is the proportion who had actually done that type of activity within the last 30 days. Pretty tight time period that we're asking about here. And again, live stream performances and pre-recorded performances stand out. I will say that online materials for kids is a bit of an outlier, not so much in this chart, but when we break this apart in terms of affiliation and look at like members or subscribers versus the general public, we see that awareness jumps, and so does use for almost all of these activities. But those connected to arts and culture tightly tend to know more about what's going on and tend to be more likely to do things. But online materials for kids is an interesting one because it doesn't follow that pattern, that it's sort of at this level for those who are affiliated, but also for the general public. So just an interesting example to focus on there. I will say that among Bostonians, live stream and pre-recorded performances is actually a little bit different. It's 54% awareness and 49% awareness for live stream versus pre-recorded, so higher for both of those. But participation, particularly in podcasts and virtual tours, is a little bit lower among Bostonians, but generally pretty parallel. And we wanted to know also, are these digital offerings valuable to people? To what extent are they getting what they need out of them? And we found that the spread of value wasn't very wide. It kind of goes from like 50 to 76%, that most people are finding digital content valuable. We do want to interrogate that a little bit more in future analysis to understand how the fact that this is all free might be playing into, or most of this is free, might be playing into people's perceptions of value. So it's kind of pulling apart what's the perceived value of paid programming versus unpaid programming or free programming. But again, here we see that online activities for kids stands out as the highest level of value at 76%. So we wanted to understand too, you know, beyond whether or not people are getting value, what are the qualities that people are getting out of the digital activities that they're participating in? And we found that having fun and relaxation, kind of emotional needs, were pretty high here. These map on fairly well to the things that people were missing from arts and cultural activities before, in terms of their proportion and kind of their general order, with the pretty big exception here of spent quality time with my friends or family. It's at 27% here, whereas it was one of the most missed qualities of arts and culture activities that were done in person, as well as sort of just what people wanted more of in their lives generally. I will say, though, that Boston is different on this respect. It's still lower than what people are saying they missed, but it's a lot higher than the national average at 40% of people in Boston saying that they're getting this quality, spending quality time with friends or family out of the digital activities that they're doing. It makes me wonder, what are you doing in Boston?
What are they doing?
It might be different, right, than other places.
You guys tell us.
And then the next kind of step, as we were thinking through how do we understand these users of digital content more deeply, was to ask, are they the same people who are always walking through your doors? Are they your sort of usual suspects? Or is digital content during COVID broadening the pool of who you might be reaching? And so take a look at within each of these categories of arts and culture organizations or types of arts and culture, of those who had used content from that type of organization online during COVID, what proportion had actually been to that type of organization anywhere in person in 2019 versus what proportion had not been in person to one of these organizations. And while we find a wide range from 74% of people using digital content from cultural centers who had not been to a cultural center in person in 2019, down to 28% for library users. Across all of the categories that we measured, we saw diversification of users, at least beyond the sort of recent attenders set, which was really exciting and interesting to us. And the next question was, okay, so you're reaching people who weren't walking through your doors, right, through digital content, but are those people different in any ways than the people who are walking through the doors? So the next level was to sort of break that apart and to look at, I'm going to use theater as an example first. So to look at those people using digital content from theaters during COVID, how do the people who hadn't been in person in 2019 differ than those who had been? And we found that those who hadn't been in person were twice as likely to be Black or African American and twice as likely to have incomes of less than $25,000 than those who had been in person. And somewhat tellingly, or very interestingly at least, we found that these differences tended towards diversification in a lot of places of audiences on dimensions that are often underrepresented in arts and culture. But they're really different from industry to industry, or from portion of arts and culture sector to other portions. So for orchestras, we found, again, an increase in those who hadn't been in person using digital content who were Black or African American. And this actually went from 2% to 30%. It's a huge increase for orchestras, but also an effect on age. So they, instead of seeing an income impact, we're seeing an age diversification impact for orchestras. And then for art museums, we're seeing an education impact here, with those who hadn't been in person being twice as likely to have a high school education or less than those who had been in person. So a lot more to explore across these 13 categories of arts and culture, that we have this kind of tracking data where we have a big enough sample that we can dive in ways that we usually can't in these kinds of studies.
Thanks, Jen. So before we go on, I just want to kind of use a conversational highlighter on those last two slides, because there are some really significant potential kind of hypotheses and implications coming out of this, particularly for organizations, as many of the places we're speaking to are thinking about kind of creating a parallel track for resources around digital, as opposed to digital always being in service to and derived from analog and physical experience. And what we're seeing potentially could suggest that there is an opportunity both first for audience expansion through digital content, kind of erasing the threshold fear for many people, and also for audience diversification, that we see much more diverse, kind of varied groups of people who are experiencing the same content that might be offered physically in a space when we remove the space and give them the opportunity to access it digitally. So this is really interesting. As Jen said, it's early days in this, but we weren't necessarily looking for this kind of finding, but we're really struck by the potential implications coming out of this about what the future of cultural digital might be. So with that, a couple more sections. First, what are people thinking about in terms of what they will do in the future? So here we asked about when you are thinking now about when people are able to go out, what are you most excited to do in the first few weeks? So this is desire. This is the idea that people have been in quarantine and there's a bunch of stuff that they just miss doing. And we gave them a huge list. They could check all that apply. Which are the ones that rose to the top? So a couple things. I'm going to deal with one chart first, and then I'm going to go to that big, ugly blue box, which should scare all of us, and I'll tell you why. But before we get to the scary box, let's look at these charts. And what we see is, not surprisingly, social connection rises to the top. That first is what I call a great bridging response, getting together with loved ones, connection, but in our homes, meaning still in spaces that we can feel more safe and more confident around. Going out to a bar or restaurant, and then we start seeing that kind of thing that many of you may have already seen in other research about potentially an inverse correlation between perceived density of cultural experience or space and likelihood to participate. So that means a garden, a park, or a zoo, which is the most open and expansive, rises to the top. But we then saw, at least in the national sample, that a bunch of people want to go to movies, which don't feel very different in terms of their physical configuration than theater spaces, which tend to go much lower on the list. And you can see as you work down, in the national sample, going to an art museum is only 9%, but we've done some slices where that number has really ballooned. So we'll know in a minute. Actually, why don't we talk about that first, how that compares to the Boston sample, and then we'll get to the scary box.
Sorry.
Okay, Jen.
I was trying to get the chat too at the same time.
I know, Jen is multitasking.
So for Boston, the interesting outlier here is dance is a lot higher than the national at 14%.
Great. So other number is pretty consistent. So what does that mean? 69% had done little or no planning now for future arts or cultural experiences. So this is what I call intentionality. And here we see this big inherent conflict that I think is in everyone's minds about going and doing stuff. A huge number of things that they desire or want to do, that list we see on the right. But when we ask them what they're actually doing now in terms of how much planning they're making to do those things, intentionality, we see that it's much lower. So this essentially means that very little of the market is what we would call in market or active consumers right now, even to make plans for the future when things are reopening. So what this means for me is I look at the weekly forecast that many of you have been seeing about people are ready to go back in a week, a month, 3 months, etc. I view those with a lot of skepticism because I understand the desire behind them, but I think you can't look at that without also going to intentionality. Is that actually compelling people to make the decision? And one of the anecdotal pieces of information I want to share with you is in talking to some organizations in different parts of the country that have already started reopening, particularly places that are offering kind of free online registration or time ticketing, they're in the highest level of no-shows that they've ever seen. And I think that is pointing out this discrepancy between kind of who you are when you book the free ticket or time slots, go to the museum in a week. And then when that day rolls around and you wake up that morning and you have to move from desire into intent, and you start thinking about what it's going to feel like, and you just decide not to show up. I think we're very much in this very conflicted moment. So again, I'd be very wary about any hardcore kind of projections about future intent. This is a really interesting chart that Jen and her team kind of drilled down. It looks a little weird, but it has a really interesting story to tell, which is that different types of art or cultural forms are associated with different desired benefits or attributes. So we're not just saying what are the kinds of things you want to do, but within each of those things, what qualities are you looking for? Really interesting, Huntington Theater and other people on the line, seeing a play, 2/3 of people say they want something fun and lighthearted, and then something emotionally powerful, and then something beautiful, versus going to a park or a zoo where the primary need, 67%, is beauty, that kind of outdoor kind of expanse, followed by fun and lighthearted, followed by comforting. Art museums, beautiful first, challenging or thought-provoking, one of the only places we see that actually in that first line, and then emotionally powerful. So you can read the other ones, but this is really interesting to know that not only does one size not fit all, but in crafting the message and even thinking about the program and the content for this moment, the audience has very particular and uniquely attributed and associated benefits that they seek based on these different forms of cultural participation.
Super interesting note for art museums in Boston that beautiful is the highest still, but culturally diverse at 50% is actually the next highest, which isn't even on the board here for most of these organizations, followed by challenging.
Yeah, and we're wondering / expecting / hoping that that culturally diverse number will really increase significantly when we go back into market in September. Sorry. So there's been a lot of charts and lists. What do you got to do? What do people expect just to feel more or less confident about re-entering public and cultural spaces? And one of the points we want to make here in this kind of division between internal and external is that your organization, as a policy decision, controls 6 out of 10 of the most influential factors. On a national sample, you actually control the single most influential factor, this 54% for increased cleaning of all touch surfaces, followed by the #1 external factor, the availability of a vaccine. But when you couple that or pair it with reduced admission levels to limit crowding, enforcement of masks for visitors, staff, health screening measures prior to entry, and then way behind organizations as it's time to reopen, you see that you guys have a lot of agency here. And while they're very high numbers for those 3 of the 4 factors that are external and that you cannot control, there's a lot that you can do to kind of add to that total blend of messages and services that are being provided. Jen, I don't know if we want to compare any of these to Boston numbers, because I have seen quite a bit of variation in some other markets.
It's interesting, they align really closely in Boston, actually.
Great. I mean, when I was just looking at the New York numbers, for example, where the vaccine becoming available was much higher than anything else in the 60s, and then it jumped down to the mid 50s. So it depends market by market, and also considering the timing. So we then asked a really interesting question that I think should factor into your longer term thoughts about strategic planning and further development. And first we just said, what are the changes you want to see in organizations to just make them better? And people can define better however they want, but they're defining it in personal terms, better for them. And first of all, we found that the vast majority, about 3/4 of people, want arts and cultural organizations to have change in the future. And there's 3 kind of groupings of the types of changes that people want. One about inclusivity and community, and again, a number of factors here that I think we can reasonably expect to increase, perhaps significantly, the next time we ask these questions. Then a cluster around enjoyment, fun, lack of formality, being more child-friendly. And then finally, this notion of kind of reflection and innovation, the idea of this narrative connection that people can make. So this is quite interesting, and I could easily see a kind of strategic visioning process that really jumps off of this page and starts thinking about further evolutions in both program and experience and the relationship that each of your organizations can have to its community in the future. So, not surprisingly, many of you have asked us, are people inclined to give right now? We know there's been a number of online campaigns to help struggling organizations survive through this time. And so people have very reasonably asked us, are people aware of what we need and how big our need is? And are they inclined to give? It turns out those are 2 very, very different questions. So first off, 96%, almost all respondents identified various ways that you guys can help their communities during the crisis. However, only 1/3 of them actually report seeing that happening. They can actually cite an example where the kinds of benefits that they feel cultural organizations are uniquely able to play right now are occurring in their community. Jen, are there local numbers that we want to look at in relative to that?
They're pretty similar.
Yeah, that's what I thought for these guys.
Mm-hmm.
But this is this really interesting duality, which is both kind of happy, sad. So first of all, if you're wondering if people know that you guys are in pain, the answer is yes. On the left, are arts and cultural organizations in my area financially struggling because of COVID-19? 2/3 of people say yes, 1/3 are neutral, only 7% disagree. But this next statement, do you agree with it or not? during this crisis, we should support other kinds of nonprofits in my area before supporting arts and cultural organizations. So here we see that almost 4 out of 10 agree that other organizations are more worthy, more needing than arts and cultural organizations, and about half the audience is neutral on this. Only 16% believe that this is not the case, that is, feel that they should support nonprofits in their, arts and cultural organizations before other nonprofits. So this really speaks to this duality, the sense that, yeah, I understand you guys are struggling, but hey, other people are struggling too, and other people or other kinds of organizations that I view as perhaps more needy. What are those organizations? So here's a kind of pre and during in terms of the kinds of causes that people are most inclined to support. Pre meant between, say, 2018 and 2019. What were the categories of organizations that you would support the most? And we saw the top one, human services, which is poverty, children's services, elderly, etc., followed by religion, followed by environment and animals, then arts, culture, and humanities, then education, then health. Perhaps not surprisingly, we see that that health area has taken a big jump from number 6 to number 3 in the middle of a health crisis, and that arts and culture is essentially tied now with the former number 3, environment and animals, in terms of causes that people would support. Anything to add to that one, Jen, before I proceed?
Just that arts and culture in Boston, both before and after, is actually in 3rd place on this list, which is kind of interesting.
And is human services and religion 1 and 2 in Boston?
Human services was 1, education was 2nd in Boston, and then after human services is 1, health is 2nd, arts and culture 3rd in both cases.
Interesting. Yeah. So finally, we just wanted to share with you this crazy thing that we did at the end of the study. Crazy because it meant people had to read literally thousands of pages of verbatim quotes, where we just asked people, we gave them an empty page and said, share your thoughts about what you think this moment is and what it means for arts and culture, etc. And we picked a couple that we thought were particularly insightful and really summed up more thematic observations and comments that people shared with us that we want to leave you with. And these are verbatim quotes. The pandemic and our country's fractured responses to it, the magnitude of illness and death, all of these are almost unendurable. We need places and ways to gather and still have joy and pleasure in our lives. Places, even if virtual, to comfort each other and to feel human, humane, and normal. So this desire for not only connection, but for positivity, for hope, the sense that together we can make each other feel better, and that we need places and experiences that can take us away from the negativity that has become so much the norm for so many of us at this moment in time. Nice to show that the arts and cultural community is resilient enough to exist beyond the beautiful buildings they're housed in. It shows that between institutions and visitors, the connection is still strong. So a lot of sentiment that goes to kind of the inherent value of culture beyond place-based values. And finally, something that I think is quite provocative and really actually quite moving, our nation's chief problem during the last 50 years is its declining social cohesion. Seems as if the arts have a role here. This wasn't acknowledged before the pandemic, but would be vital as we move to a different existence within the worldwide community after the pandemic. So quickly, I just want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing next. Jen referred to some of it. CultureTech.com has all this and so much more, including a queryable database. If your organization participated, you can actually look on some key metrics, how your audience's data compares to the national samples. And all the data is available there. Jen and her group are about to enter into a qualitative phase to add depth and nuance to some of the things that surfaced in this quantitative report through an interview process. And we're continuing with segment-specific analysis, looking at, for example, response patterns among communities of color, different regional differences, and generational subsets. The queryable tool for organizations is actually available now. Is that correct, Jen?
Yep, for organizations that participated, and then a publicly accessible tool, which will have the national sample, but won't have any individual organization data attached, will be available in the next few weeks.
So finally, wave 2, which we are continuing securing funding for. So if you know any organizations who want to support this from a foundation perspective, this is a great moment because this is free to the field. No one's making any money off of this. We're just trying to provide a foundation, a baseline of knowledge that otherwise wouldn't exist. As we go into the second wave, which we are scheduling for in September, there's, in addition to continuing and following up some of the lines of inquiry from the first study that you've seen some findings, we're going to go much deeper into certain areas that we've been asked about, particularly since our previous survey was fielded before some of the most pressing cries for addressing issues of racial and social injustice surfaced. So clearly, there's a role, an expectation, and very specific perceptions about the relationship between the cultural community and the fight for racial and social justice. So we'll be looking at that. We'll be looking also at this really interesting issue that Jen shared with us about the emerging role of technology and its potential to become an audience development tool. And finally, what I would consider to be the Wild West of this moment and kind of the next big topic, what are people going to be like in these spaces when we reopen, knowing that different audience members have different attitudes and behaviors around health and hygiene practices, and therefore knowing that you guys are going to be playing host to and perhaps even mediating behaviors with different audience members. We don't know how this is going to go. There's some early anecdotal information, but by the time we come back in September, we'll want to start finding out how people feel about this from the audience perspective and whether it is impacting their propensity to participate in culture. So thank you for that. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and we can take some questions.
Cara, I know we've butted right up against time here, so just let us know if we need to be available on email for questions or how you want to proceed.
If you're both available, I think we could take just another few minutes and see if there's anybody who wants to ask something, or I think any reactions even to what you heard would be helpful. And I would just ask, people can add things into the chat. If you also want to raise your hand, you could hop on the video and just talk. And by raise hand, I mean raise the Zoom hand.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. ¿Cómo estás? Bien, ¿y tú? Pues es que nunca se...
Okay, so let me just then invite everybody to go to the website and to really dig in. There's a lot of good stuff there. If your organization has not participated in the first wave of the survey and you have an interest in doing so in the second, please reach out to Jen or let us know. As Jen said, we're casting a very wide net. We have a particular focus on making sure that we do the best job we can in terms of representing a diversity of voices, particularly from communities of color in the second wave. So please let us know if you haven't participated in the first and you want to be in the second. We'd love to hear from you. Anything you want to add, Jen?
No, I was just looking at this comment about classical and music performances. Just seeing, I have the survey instrument open, was trying to, so I might follow up with Margaret if that's possible. So she had asked about how does classical music fit into this concerts and musical performances category. I just want to be able to circle back because the way that there's so many questions on this survey and things are framed differently in different places sometimes depending on the context. I want to make sure that I have that data, but happy to write you, Margaret, if you will send me a note.
Right.
Or I'll send you a note.
And I see that Therese has a cutoff date for the new survey. I don't think we've set one yet because we're in the process of both developing the survey instrument and starting to look at the lists. So if you're interested, now's the time. What method of survey was used, written or phone? This was a digital online survey. Great. All right, so with that, I think we may be out for time. So I'm gonna throw it back to our host.
Thank you both so much. There's so much information in there, and that's my second time hearing most of that, and I'm still I'm processing. But it's really interesting and it's super helpful. I hope folks on the call have a chance to digest that as well. And we'll have to have you back once you're into the next phase.
That'd be
so
great.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah.
Being here.
Absolutely.
That's it for us. Thanks everyone for staying on, and we will be in touch. A reminder, there's no meeting next Friday, but we'll follow up over email, and have a good weekend.